When he darted at length his dragon strength, an earthquake shook the rock, and the fireflakes bright fell around the knight, as unmoved he met the shock. Today we live in an age of information, where increasingly many tales we're exposed to in contemporary culture are of an ever-distant origin, not just in time, but often in location. Much of the rich local cultural traditions and tales associated with the northern English counties are all but forgotten, fading quickly from popular memory. However, there is one legend in particular, from the northeast of England, which endures on, continuing to grip the imagination of each new generation. And that legend is the Lambton worm. The tale takes place in what is now part of the new town of Washington, which coincidentally happens to include the ancestral home of the Washington family, from which the first President of the United States, George Washington, descends. Although the precise date of the story is uncertain, some of the sources believe that the young heir to the Lambton estate mentioned in this well-known local tale is Sir John Lambton, a crusader knight of Rhodes belonging to the 14th century. Anyway, that's enough about the setting. Join me now as we delve deep into the legend of the worm, and let's see where it takes us. Legend has it that the heir of Lambton was a young and mischievous lad who had favoured fishing on the banks of the River Wear rather than attending church on a Sunday. Consequently, one such fateful Sunday morning, this rebellious youth was sitting idly, fishing rod in hand, when suddenly something extraordinary tugged forcefully on his line. Being of a tenacious nature, young Lambton fought with every fibre of his being, and after some time managed to haul this curious, unyielding catch out of the water. However, to John Lambton's great surprise, the creature he hooked was no fish, but instead a worm of disgusting appearance, with 9 holes either side of its mouth. It's worth mentioning at this point that you shouldn't be thinking of this creature as a worm in the contemporary sense of the word, but instead as some kind of serpent. William Henderson, in his notes on the folklore of the northern counties, points out that the regional use of the word worm in this story actually comes from the Scandinavian word orma, a word used to refer to a serpent or a dragon. Anyway, that's enough explanation. Let's get back to the story. Disgusted with his catch, the young heir tore this peculiar little beast from his hook and threw it down a nearby well. An account of the story in the Bishopric Garland stated that the location of the well was still known at the time of its publishing in 1834. It is believed to have been situated somewhere between Worm Hill, which we'll hear more about later, and the River Wear, and was known locally as the Worm Well. So seeing the boy hastily dispose of his catch, a passerby asked him what game he had reeled in. The boy responded unnervingly, saying, "I think I've caught the devil himself." Motioning for the man to take a look, the passerby cast his gaze upon the wretch and told young Lambton that he'd never seen anything quite like it before. Struggling to describe the form of this curious creature, the man likened its appearance to an eft or a newt and provided a solemn warning that it tokened no good. Left to its own devices in that fateful well, the worm began to grow at an alarming rate, and eventually it was so big that a new home had to be found. As it wandered further from the well, the beast began to develop a great fondness for 2 nearby features in the local landscape. The first was a substantial rock protruding from the middle of the River Wear, which the worm could often be seen coiled around when the sun was up. However, at the end of each day, when the light had begun to fade, the worm would seek out its favourite site of slumber at a large nearby hill known to this very day as Worm Hill. As the years went by, the worm grew to such a size that it was reckoned it could coil itself 3 times around the hill's base. And, with its great size, came a voracious appetite, as it killed lambs and developed a taste for the milk of the native cattle. The beast terrified the locals and laid waste to its immediate neighbourhood. Consequently, it wasn't long before the surrounding vicinity became nothing more than a barren wasteland. Therefore, seeking to satisfy its craving for local livestock, the worm turned its attention towards Lambton Hall and crossed the river in search of more food. Startled by this development, the Lord of Lambton and father of the boy who plucked the cursed creature from the river convened an urgent council of his most trusted advisers. Following much discussion, it was the counsel of one man, an elderly steward, that captured the attention of the Lord. Having recognised the creature's preference for cow's milk, the steward recommended that a large stone trough situated in the courtyard of Lambton Hall be filled with milk. The Lord heeded the advice and filled the trough. Then the inhabitants of the hall looked on in terror as the worm ominously drew closer in search of food. Catching sight of the milk, the foul serpent headed directly for the trough and immediately devoured its contents. Fortunately, to the delight of the onlookers, the milk appeared to have been sufficient to satisfy the beast's ravenous appetite. Now content, and in need of a nap, the worm turned and headed back to its favourite hill without inflicting injury or suffering on a single soul. Over the following weeks and months, it was observed that the perfect quantity of milk required to satisfy the worm's thirst was 9 kai, which is equal to the yield of 9 cows. It was noted that any less than this would cause the worm to display signs of rage, as it would upend nearby trees and pull them out by their roots. Well, the years passed by and the locals continued to be terrorised by the worm. Seeking fame, fortune and justice, many a gallant knight would venture to the area, looking to relieve the local people of this terrible plight. However, all of their efforts were in vain, for the worm possessed an awesome ability. Whenever it was cut asunder, any of the severed parts would instinctively seek each other out, reuniting in an unusual regenerative process which sustained the worm till its opponents were then finally overcome and defeated. This situation continued for 7 long years, until one day, rather unexpectedly, the young heir who first wrestled this terrible worm from the River Wear returned to his family estate. The boy was now a man, a member of the Order of the Knights Hospitaller. Sir John had spent many years fighting in the bloody crusades of the 14th century and had returned home battle-hardened, older and much wiser. Heading eagerly to his ancestral hall, Sir John was surprised to find his father a broken man. He was worn out by grief and sorrow. His father told him of the desolation and destruction the worm had wreaked across his lands, and of the horror and tragedy it had brought to the lives of those living nearby. So, perhaps feeling some kind of guilt for his part in the worm's arrival, Sir John resolved to rid the land of this dreaded serpent. Cautiously crossing the river, John decided to patiently observe the worm and its habits. Having heard the stories of the fallen knights and the beast's near invincible nature, the heir decided to seek the counsel of a local sibyl or wise woman. Upon his reception, the wise woman wasted little time in explaining that he, the once rebellious youth and now Knight of Rhodes, was responsible for this source of misery now afflicting the region. Despite her initial hostility, she did, however, agree to help him, providing he swore to make a solemn vow that upon slaying the foul beast, he would then kill the first living thing he met. Furthermore, the Sibyl warned that failure to keep this oath would result in a curse falling upon the lords of Lambton, such that for 9 generations no lord of Lambton would die in their bed. Accepting the wise woman's terms, Sir John received the following advice. You should take your best suit of mail and stud it with spear blades. Wearing this suit, you must then make your way to the worm's favoured rock located in the middle of the river, for this must be the site of the battle. Upon hearing the counsel of the Sibyl, Sir John returned to Lambton Hall, where he discussed the plan with his father, agreeing that upon the defeat of the worm he would blow a blast on his bugle horn to signify his victory. Furthermore, upon hearing the blast, his father should let loose the heir's favourite hound in order for it to be sacrificed in fulfilment of his vow to the Sibyl. Following this discussion with his father, the Knight of St. John headed straight to Bridgeford, the chapel of his forefathers, where he swore the oath promised to the Sibyl. The following day, the worm woke at its usual time. It unwound itself from around the hill and headed towards Lambton Hall for its daily quota of milk. Approaching the rock, the worm caught sight of the knight's glimmering armour in the morning sun, and enraged by such an act of defiance, the worm hastily made its way towards the knight. Somewhat unnerved by the furious beast's rapid advance, Sir John stood steadfast on the top of the rock, sword in hand and eager for battle. Perhaps this fragment from an old original ballad recorded in 1834 best captures the moment. The worm shot down the middle stream like a flash of living light, and the waters kindled around his path in rainbow colours bright. But when he saw the armed knight, he gathered all his pride, and coiled in many a radiant spire rode buoyant o'er the tide. When he darted at length his dragon strength, an earthquake shook the rock, and the fireflakes bright fell around the knight as unmoved he met the shock. Though his heart was stout, it quivered no doubt, his very lifeblood run cold, as around and around the wild worm wound in many a grappling fold. So the story goes that as the beast swiftly approached the rock, the knight struck the serpent on the head with all his might, but it produced no visible effect, other than to make it somewhat vexed. In response, the worm began coiling itself tightly around Sir John in a crushing and poisonous embrace. However, the closer it pressed itself into the knight, the more severe became the wounds inflicted upon the worm by Sir John's spearhead-encrusted armour. The wounds to the worm were so fierce that it was said that the river had run crimson. The more tightly the worm squeezed, the weaker it became, until, eventually, it had to relinquish its crushing grip, and it was at this point that Sir John seized his opportunity. Wielding his trusty sword, the heir of Lambton brought it crashing down, severing the worm in two. The wisdom of the Sibyl's advice then became fully apparent. As the severed part fell into the river, it was immediately swept away by the strong current, leaving the worm unable to reunite itself. Strengthened by this sight, Sir John redoubled his efforts, and after a long and bloody battle, the worm was finally defeated, chopped into numerous segments, each washed away by the crimson waters. Thoroughly exhausted and desperately tired following this heroic ordeal, Sir John made his way to the riverbanks. He held his bugle horn to his lips and gave a blast with his remaining breath. At this point, legend has it that the whole household had been praying incessantly for John's victory, such that when his father heard the bugle horn assuring him of his son's safety, he forgot everything and, overcome by relief and joy, ran speedily to embrace his son. Sir John, surprised and horrified to see his father rushing across the fields, was overcome by feelings of grief and could not take the life of his elderly parent. Thus, in an act of desperation, hoping that the curse could still be averted, Sir John gave a second blast on his trusty bugle, upon which his favourite hound broke loose and bounded loyally towards him. Unsheathing his dagger, Sir John reluctantly plunged its sharp tip deep into the heart of his faithful companion. Despite the significance of this sacrifice, its magnitude was not sufficient to appease his sworn oath. The effort had been in vain, and legend has it that the Sibyl's curse pressed heavily on the lords of Lambton for 9 generations. Local tradition tells us that during this time, none of the lords of Lambton died in their beds, with the final victim being the colliery owner and British Whig politician Henry Lambton, who died in his carriage crossing the new bridge at Lambton in 1761. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this traditional northern tale. Perhaps it's awakened your curiosity in the various worm stories associated with the northern counties, of which there are quite a few. If so, please like and subscribe to the channel. As mentioned at the beginning of this video, this story is one of the more resilient and well-known northern folk tales, one that's still an active part of the local culture. However, there are many more, most of which have all but faded from common memory, and they now live an obscure existence consigned to the pages of little-known books. And it's these stories that I will look to bring to life in future videos.